It was growing dark and a hammering was coming on the door. Woozily, Osrith to her feet and managed to get to it, pulling across the bar and opening it. It was Miral. "Where have you been? Your men have been waiting for an hour. You are due to change with Hayard's men. I had to tell them to stay longer, he's not happy." Miral caught her arm as she toppled towards him, and helped her back to her feet. "Easy now, deep sleep?" he asked her. "I wasn't supposed to be doing this," Osrith complained. "Talk to the men, easy guard duty," she repeated his words. I know, but Eadgilf's attention was drawn to you by one of his men, and I was compelled to send you. There is no one else to guard for us. We lost many to Tenhulg, and the blessed West Saxons are due any day, which will be a curse as well as a blessing." The man looked exhausted, and Osrith nodded. "Give me 5 more minutes. I need food." She saw his expression. "I need to piss," she tried. "When women say 5 minutes, they mean an hour," Miral grumbled, as Osrith closed the door in his face. She crossed to the courtyard at the back, and fouled the culvert that was, thankfully, running away out of the city, and at least would not end up in someone's dinner pot that night. "Come on, then," Osrith said, 5 minutes later, as promised, and she stalked past Miral, and down the street. To their credit, her men, including Elfrith, were waiting for her, stature still and alert. "When we go inside," Osrith began, "remember this. We are on close guard for our Lord tonight. We are the people to whom he may turn, for food, for drink, for medicine, to piss and shit. And we are the people who prevent anyone from causing our Lord harm. This is our duty, until dawn tomorrow, and then we will be relieved by more mercenaries, who will be told the same by their captain. Do you understand?" "Yes, Captain," they shouted, in unison. "But the Lord Ethliard will remember you. Remember our company. Because we are the cleanest company he will ever have the pleasure of attending him." Osrith was glad of the good-humoured laughter that the men gave her to her quip. She needed it, as the night wore on. A generous Miral called Osrith to the door several hours into the watch and handed her meat and bread, of which she was grateful, and took her place while she stood outside and ate it. She stood, because if she were to sit, Osrith knew she would close her eyes again, and that would be of no use whatsoever. And the food revived her, as did a few sips of goat's milk. A maid hovered just behind her, and relieved her of plate and cup once she had finished, and she pushed on the Lord's bedroom door, eyes turning to her as Osrith entered. And she wished she hadn't had to. Osrith had seen this man, in the heat and thrust of battle. She had seen him sit in Mercia's throne giving out judgment, wise judgment to his people. She had seen him force a show of unity with Ethelflaed when it was clear they despised one another. Ethliard had been so vigorous, so full of life, to be brought so low in the last battle, head wound that would not heal. A maid came to replace the pillow, and left with her back to him, presumably so he would not see that his blood had saturated the cloth so much. But he surely would know, and despite her postern and a guard, had an urge to touch his hand and wish him comfort. Osrith had seen him ride out, that day, at Tenhulg, with the courage of men as he fought Northman after Northman. She reckoned Ethliard of Mercia could count higher than 13. If he could count to 50, he would be proud of his achievements that day. But his horse had stumbled, breaking its jaw as it crumpled onto its forelegs, throwing Ethliard over its head. The Lord had landed awkwardly, to which a large bandage around his head attested. Osrith could only infer that he had broken his skull. The pillow behind his head, though it must have been changed before her guard had got to his chamber, was staining, slowly, red, at an almost hypnotic rate. Worse, he was constantly shifting in his bed, his forehead moist with sweat at this exertion, as if the man was seeking for relief from his pain that he could never find. Beside him, a woman sat, hair almost as red as Edra's, long and thick, tethered with 2 clips beside her ears, head bent, soothing his fever. It could only be Eadith. Miral had told her of the woman, Ethliard's mistress, now out of a job. It was clear that Eadgilf's power was in danger of falling. Now his sister could not service their lord. But that was not the worst of it. No, the worst of it was the constant smell of shit, which was leaking from the man's backside and soaking into the sheets. Around them, a few hours later, maids came to take the sheets away, rolling Ethlierd's hips around one way and then the other, to take the soiled ones away and leaving new ones, and Osrith considered whether she should have bothered about to wash new clothes for her men. A few hours into the night, and Ethlierd suddenly opened his eyes, seemed brighter, and began to talk to the guards as if he knew them, leaning towards Elfkin as much as he was able, and asked about the day. Elfkin looked across to Osrith uncertainly, but Osrith thought it was no bad thing, and her youngest warrior began to tell the Lord of Mercia of their guard duty, and their ale and their bathing in the river, something which seemed to amuse the Lord, and he gave what he probably thought was a laugh, but became a snort and a choke, and then Ethlierd slumped down onto his pillow, which then began to collect blood leaking at a more substantial rate into the pillow's fibers. When he had stopped coughing, Ethlierd beckoned for a GLSS of water, which Egelfrith helped him with, placing the glass beside his lips. As he leaned for it, Edith grabbed it from Egelfrith's hands, guiding it near herself, her fire-red hair flowing over Ethlierd's bedclothes. Osrith watched as the Lord coughed most of it back up again. Edith reached for a cloth, and dabbed at his bedclothing, his lips, and her own dress. A very patient woman, as well she may be. When Ethlierd departed this life, she would have no status, no influence, no money. It was in her interests to have him live as long as possible. And yet, she was patient because she was caring for the man, and Osrith saw a look of tenderness in her eyes when she called for more. If it is a case that a person gets scolded for attempting to help, I will instruct my guards to ignore the wishes of their lord, Osrith chided, then instantly regretted it, when she saw the look on Edith's face, one of shame mixed with a hearty helping of both anger and despair. But neither of the women spoke, for Lord Ethlierd's eyes were now open, and he was surveying his men. Osrith shifted her weight, and waited. "You," he said suddenly, trying to raise a hand. As he did so, blood oozed behind him, and this exertion on his body made him lean backwards. But Ethlierd's eyes were still alert, and he beckoned Elfkin to him. A glance to Osrith, and she nodded her agreement. "My lord," said the young warrior, simply. "Your lord wishes to hear a tale. You look as if you know a tale." Elfkin looked unusually nervous, but he handled the situation and replied, "Many, my lord." "Then, I should like to hear one." Elfkin turned his head to Osrith. This was not what he was expecting, but Osrith nodded, and suggested to him the story they had often been told by her beloved deputy Elfgar had told them, on a long march somewhere. "You know the one about the two travelers?" she prompted. And relief flooded the boy's face. "My lord, there were two travelers, once at home in their village," he began, "and made it as far as two other travelers who joined them, an exiled king." At this, Osrith recalled her ancestor, who they had rescued from Bardney, Oswald, a magic ring, elves, goblins and the green man of the forest. At length, Ethlierd held up a shaky hand, and looked across to Edith, who leaned towards him. "My lord believes this tale is to be heathen," she repeated, and at once, Elfkin stood back up, straight, his face frozen. "I know another," Osrith proposed, and when Edith had told Lord Ethlierd, she saw him not, and told him about the quest that Saint Brendan was tasked to sail out from Arion. There was no way this could be interpreted as heathen, about ascent and God's will, and she told them all about the journey north, of being crushed, nearly, by a mighty beast that lived in the northern oceans, and their amazement at mountains that spewed fire. As time pressed on, Ethlierd held up another hand, and with it, fended off Edith with it, leaning back onto his pillow again. Osrith felt very conscious that there was little of the linen cloth left unsullied by Ethlierd's blood. "Another," he breathed, when all guards had dropped to waiting silence, and he looked at Osrith again. "I know you," he managed, his blue eyes open wider now, and he pointed to her. "You went away. I sent you to work for me. You sent me to Wessex, if you recall, my lord," Osrith replied, and Ethlierd opened his eyes still wider, before relaxing back onto his pillow again. "You are of Alba," he said, "but this time, This sounded less of an accusation, more a conversation. You will have many stories. You were recommended Lord Aldhelm. Dead, at Tenholg, if you recall, Edith interrupted. My brother, the Lord Eardgulf, advises you, my lord. Lord Eardgulf. Athleard spat, angrily. Who made him lord? You did, my lord, Edith replied, and Osrith saw the woman flush at the cheeks. Do you not recall? Athleard jerked his head towards his mistress, and as he did so, caused himself to cough, and a foul smell leaked into the air, as Athleard soiled his bed again. Osrith glanced at her men and, to their credit, did not flinch. I do have many stories, Osrith confessed, and she watched Athleard close his eyes, as she told them of Arrow and Monastery and Norse and Alba, and she watched the Lord Athleard's breathing begin to slow to a steady rhythm as he listened to Osrith's words. When he closed his eyes, Osrith stopped, suddenly, at the raid Blashku by the enemy, who they did not know were the enemy, and everyone in the room drew in their breath that she could stop at such a crucial point. May you continue? Asked Edith, her eyes shimmering in the torchlight. I do believe our lord has gone to sleep, Osrith replied, but the lady was not giving up. Can you tell us, at least, did the warriors escape the Green Valley Fortress? Edith asked, and Osrith felt herself nodding, as the woman seemed to relax a little. Escaped, for now, Osrith added, and the woman gave her a that was cheeky look. As hours moved on, Edith sat back in a chair and was soon asleep in it, her head forward. Elfrith, who was standing near her, moved Edith's head into a more comfortable position, and she yawned a little. Osrith felt her own eyes begin to grow heavy, and she strode to the door. As she expected, Miral was the other side of it, with one of the younger guards, and he turned to her, jerkily, his face bright with interest. Nothing, Osrith assured him, nodding towards Athleard. He is as he was. I just need a breath of fresh air, she added, then I will let my men go one at a time for a piss. Yes, Miral agreed, and he called another young guard to take Osrith's face. The young man looked at his commander, and then back into Athleard's bedchamber, his nose screwing up at the stench. Osrith, meanwhile, strode to the end of the passage and into the courtyard, where the blessed night air was sweet and fresh on her skin, and she hastened to the kitchens, taking up some of the water that had been boiled for the next day into a stone jar and threw the lot of it down her throat, before refilling it, and sipping at a more sober pace. You can't take that. A maid yelled at her. When she saw it was one of the captains of the king's guards, she stopped, and began to walk slower to Osrith, her mouth made into a smile. I'll get more for you, Osrith replied, and the girl stopped for a moment, before bowing her head in a shy way. Captain, she said, thank you. Only, the cook will beat me if any of his things are touched before the morning. He will never know, Osrith told her, and took up one of the stone ewers into which ale would be brewed. It was empty and clean, hanging overhead in a rack, and took it with her out into the courtyard. Her own culvert had fresh water, Osrith knew, and it was easy to get into a vessel, so she trod the streets back to her home, crossed to the back of the house and knelt by the stream. In no time at all, the water had filled the stone jar, and Osrith was back walking towards the palace. She did not hear the shout at first, could not discern the meaning, for the call was from the ramparts and the sound projected around. Osrith dashed towards the square, the maid waiting anxiously by the palace's side gate, and thrust the water jar into her hands. Thank you, she called, but Osrith was away, up the steps to the ramparts, to the black view of the night landscape. Or rather, that was what it should have been. Buet was in Osrith's hand now as she listened again for the shout. Light. Light was the shout, and there was light. Indeed, a river of light over the hills coming from the southwest and heading towards Aylesbury. From her vantage point, Osrith estimated the front of the burning torches of what appeared to be a procession was about 5 miles away. She charged down the steps again, and called for Miral. Oswald, you stand with Elfia, he urged, before making a break towards Osrith, who told him what she had seen. Then he ran up the same steps, which were becoming a little damp from the mist in that night air. Men. Raise bows, arrows, was Miral's response, and around the perimeter of the walls a creaking sounded, as guards readied arrows to defend Aylesbury. What? Shouted Eardwulf, who seemed to have a different idea, and he ordered more guards to stand with those already guarding the ramparts. The line was drawing nearer as Osrith watched, and Miral called for 2 more captains, who he ordered to bar the gates to the city. Danes? He asked, staring out into the torchlit darkness. They would not come so orderly, Osrith proposed. They would be more cunning if they were trying to ambush us. No Danish army would come like this. She was right, and, as the dawnlight edged the horizon, the torches lit on men who were clothed in the uniform of the West Saxon Guard. Osrith leaned forward and tried to see who it was who had clambered down from his horse at the front. A shout went up, but no gates were flung open and the man strode to the gates, using the hilt of his sword to bang upon the steel-hinged oak doors that were barring his men from entering. Another shout, and Osrith got down the steps. In front of her was Eardwulf, who had his sword drawn. She could hear the 2 men exchanging words, and one of them was, "Arseling. Open this gate immediately, you foul-breathed gutter swine." For a man fabled for little intelligence, the man without the gates had a brilliant imagination for insults. It was steeper, and Osrith could not help smiling. Eventually the gates were opened, and about 60 men rode through, slowly, as if they had ridden a long distance, and Osrith wondered whether they had come all the way from Winchester in one stint. "What is the meaning of drawing bow and blade to fellow Saxons?" Stipa demanded, as he dropped from his horse. He was a clear head above Eardwulf, but the Mercen Lord was not giving an inch, his steel-blue eyes glaring right back at the head of the Wessex Guard. "We were given no warning of your arrival," he replied, obsequiously. "You could have been Danes. We are West Saxons, and you are Saxons." Stipa hit back, hotly, thrusting his rein into Eardwulf's hand. "Do we look like Danes?" he demanded. "We are hungry." Stipa was always hungry. He beckoned to his men, who were looping reins over bars, the common signal for stable hands to show which horses needed tending, and the men followed Stipa up the steps and into Aylesbury's great hall. "You will find the Lord Ethelred indisposed," Eardwulf called, in Stipa's wake, as he strode next to him, but unable to keep pace with the big man. "Dying, is what I heard," Stipa replied, then wheeled round onto the man, and Osrith chuckled to herself when she saw her old friend tap the hilt of his sword a couple of times, just this, reminding Eardwulf he had it. "No weapons in the hall," Eardwulf replied, as if to try to seize back control of the situation. "Perhaps your messenger was late? Murdered on his way from peaceful Wessex to peaceful Mercia to tell us of your coming?" Stipa turned from his intention of walking into the hall, and looked down at Eardwulf. The man's sarcasm wasted, for Stipa either ignored it, or, Osrith sensed, did not understand it. "I know nothing about a messenger," he told Eardwulf. "I do know the king is on the way, and will be here tomorrow." "The king of Wessex," Eardwulf corrected. "His sister is already here," he added, and Osrith turned at that moment and walked back out of the hall. His sister. Of Ethelflaed, she had seen none, but sensed that her brother was not there. Ute had always managed to find a way to draw attention to himself, and all of Aylesbury would know if he were in the city. "You guard!" Eardwulf called after her, something Osrith had hoped would not happen. She turned. "Weren't you supposed to be on close guard to the Lord Ethelred?" "Yes, Lord," Osrith replied, her face fixed. This was it, he was going to recognize her. But, she supposed, when Eardwulf did not, many years had passed since their last meeting, and he was indisposed with things more important than a guard. "But I was ordered by the West Saxon commander to fetch water." "Indeed?" Eardwulf shouted back. "Fetch it then, and return to my Lord Ethelred. Wessex does not command here." But, as Osrith looked about her, as the Wessex Guard began to make its way into Aylesbury, orders flying, countermanding Mercen orders, Osrith thought that there could only be trouble. This came to a head the next day, after Osrith's company was relieved, and sleep was sought. They were called to the armory in the afternoon where Miral stood, grim-faced, his arms folded as Eardwulf stood before the captains. "It is a grave thing I must speak to you about," Eardwulf began, as Osrith tried to stifle a yawn. Around her, captains shuffled their feet. Osrith wondered which of them were captain to the two mercenary guard who were being taken away to their holding cells at the back of the armory, usually reserved for men who had been drunkenly fighting others. They probably had been, but that Steeper had two West Saxons under sword as well suggested rivalry, hostility, between the two guard factions. The Wessex Guard have arrived, and soon will King Edward of Wessex, to discuss the succession in Mercia. We must, and Eardwulf emphasized the must, work with the West Saxon Guard. Yes, he conceded. They do things differently in Wessex, we all know that. And Osrith caught the tone. It was the same one that Miral had used when he told her his motive for finding out the warrior's intentions was peace. He, like Eardwulf, was for Mercia, an independent Mercia, and now that independence was threatened merely by the West Saxon warriors arriving, Eardwulf could not risk unrest, especially with his own lofty ambitions. "We have always worked together," Eardwulf continued, looking at his captains one by one, and Osrith thought that, though she disliked the man, and Miral had insinuated he had given bad advice to Ethelred, he seemed a good leader, and spoke fairly to his commanders, who would, as Osrith would, talk fairly to their men. Osrith saw Eardwulf nod to one of the commanders near him, who had raised a hand. The Wessex men want to use their own pattern of guarding. The captain, a stocky, middle-aged man, with a neck like a bull and a determined look on his face. They want their drill times. They wanted their guard times. They do not suit ours. Looking back, Osrith would remember standing, crammed in the armory so the door could be shut and Eardwulf not overheard, that time when she had discovered the beginnings. At the time, she did not know what it was the beginnings of, but it was something which would take several years to build, and would ultimately result in a different fate for the kingdom of Mercia. At first, little things, shift timings, who was with whom. Mealtimes were different in Wessex, too, coinciding with merchants arriving by river, and up from the coast. Mercia had no such dependence on the tides and they dined after sunrise, afternoon and supped at nightfall, but Eardwulf cautioned the captains all the same and told them that whether the guards were from men of the same land, from somewhere in Britannium, or from somewhere far away, they should seek unity, and ordered the West Saxon and Mercians not to segregate themselves from one another. "It shouldn't matter," said one of the young men near the front, who even Osrith was surprised had spoken up without permission. "We are all Saxons together." Osrith peered at the man, and found that he was not dressed in the tabard of green and gold of Mercia, but pale blue, and in him she recognized someone she knew, Godwin. Godwin, with Hayard, had been young guards in the Lord Odda's service when Osrith had first come to West. Hal had grown from a child, snivelling under Miral's harsh commands and chastisements, to a broad, upright, fair-haired warrior, clearly obtaining rank enough to be present when the head of the Mercian Guard called his captains. "We will gladly fall in with the ways of Mercia," Godwin furthered, "until we gain clear, unequivocal orders from Wessex." And Osrith realized then that the West Saxons wanted peace, too. Of course they did. Why would you come across the country to another lord's estate, which is what Aylesbury was, in effect, to be the object of trouble for your hosts? Osrith's thoughts then considered whether this had been a test, set by Steeper, or Edward, even, to see what would happen when the West Saxons got there. Under Eardwulf, then, there would be tolerance and unity, for they were, after all, in the same employ, guard Burhs against Danes, shelter the people, fight when needed. They did not want to trouble one another with animosity between thieves. But one lord did dissented, and Osrith was not surprised when the guard, son of one of the lords of Mercia, Burgd, had stood before Eardwulf. Outranking him in status, Burgd had protested that the people of Aylesbury, in fact all of Mercia, were Angles, they had different customs, different ways. "And you will show them the ways, Lord Burgd," Eardwulf replied, nodding and smiling, although there was some strain behind the man's face, which was not surprising considering the precariousness of his position beside Ethelred. Osrith never did know why she spoke up. After Birgit had spoken there was a silence, and she heard her own words diffusing through the captains. Maybe she had not meant to speak loud enough to be heard, but heard she was by Eardwulf, who turned to Osrith as he heard her say, "Perhaps we need to get to know one another's ways, to better serve our lord and our king." "Indeed," Eardwulf replied. "Indeed. An excellent point, well made, Captain.